Have you ever noticed how some leaders, it seem like they're on the fast track, everything's going great, and then suddenly they hit a wall?
Yeah, it's almost like they're destined for the top and then something happens and they stall out, or even worse.
It really makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes, right?
Yeah,
What's happening beneath the surface that's holding them back?
exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're talking about those hidden drivers of leadership derailment.
Those kind of ingrained patterns, the ways we react without even thinking about it, they can really sabotage us.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting is that these aren't always obvious flaws or weaknesses.
Right.
They're often the flip side of what makes these leaders successful in the first place.
Oh, interesting.
But then when they're under pressure, it gets pushed to an extreme and it becomes a problem.
I see. So it's like their strength becomes a weakness.
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, what we really want to do is give you a solid understanding of these dynamics, almost like a shortcut to recognizing them, both in yourself and in others.
Absolutely.
And we've got some really powerful tools to help us do just that.
We do.
We're going to start with Jennifer Garvey Berger's Mindtraps. Have you heard of
Oh,
these?
yeah, mind traps. They're fascinating.
These are those cognitive shortcuts our brains take that can sometimes really limit our perspective.
Right.
Then we'll move on to the Hogan Development Survey, or the HDS, which highlights these potential derailers.
Yeah, the HDS is a great tool.
These are personality traits that can actually become liabilities under stress.
Right.
And finally, we'll unpack Lester Luborsky's Core Conflictual Relationship Theme. This is a mouthful, but it's CCRT,
CCRT.
which helps us understand those recurring patterns that we all have in our interpersonal struggles.
That's right.
So think of this deep dive as equipping yourself with a powerful new toolkit for navigating the complexities of leadership, which is what we're all about.
Absolutely.
So let's dive right in and start with those mind traps. What makes them so tricky, so trappy?
Well, the thing about mind traps is they feel so natural. They feel so efficient in the moment.
Right.
They're essentially cognitive distortions, unconscious ways that we simplify all the information that's coming at us constantly. It's like our brain is trying to be helpful, but it ends up trapping us in this limited way of seeing the world.
So it's not like a conscious decision to be narrow-minded.
No, no,
It's
no.
more like our brains are kind of wired with these default settings.
Exactly.
Okay, so Jennifer Garvey Berger identifies 5 common mind traps. The first one is the identity mind trap. What is that all about?
So the identity mind trap, that's when our sense of who we are becomes so fixed, so rigid that we resist any feedback that might challenge that identity.
Oh, I see.
It's that classic, this is just how I am, or this is how I've always done things. And that's a huge barrier to growth.
That makes total sense. If you see yourself, as the innovator,
Yeah,
it would be really hard to hear that your latest idea is maybe not so great.
exactly.
What's another one of these mind traps?
Well, the second one is the simple story
Right.
mind trap. And this is our tendency to create these really simple narratives around complex situations,
Right.
We
Right.
often divide people into heroes and villains.
Right. It's us versus them.
Exactly.
Good versus evil.
And it prevents us from really appreciating all the different factors at play. Really understanding why people might act the way they do. It really shuts down curiosity.
Right, because we think we already have the answer.
Exactly.
So it's like we're hardwired for that, the good versus evil, even when reality is so much more complicated.
Right.
How does that actually play out in a leadership position?
Well, think about team conflicts.
Okay.
Instead of trying to understand everyone's perspective, what's going on, a leader who's caught in the simple story trap, they might immediately label one person as the problem, right? And the other person is the victim.
Right.
And then they miss the systemic issues or even their own contribution to the whole dynamic.
Wow. Okay. So that's a big one. What's the next mind trap we should be aware of?
Okay, the next one is the rightness mind trap.
Rightness.
And this is that deep-seated conviction that our own perspective is the correct one, the right one.
Oh, yeah.
This makes us resistant to new information and can really shut down a healthy debate, that back and forth that you need. What's fascinating here is how it can blind us to our own biases.
It's like having a built-in echo chamber, right?
Yeah,
If you're already convinced you're right, why would you even consider other possibilities?
exactly.
That sounds particularly dangerous, especially in, today's world where things are changing so rapidly.
Absolutely. Innovation relies on a willingness to be wrong,
Right.
to experiment, to learn,
Uh,
and the rightness mind trap just shuts that all down.
got it. Okay, so we've got 3. What's number 4?
Okay, so number 4 is the agreement mind trap.
Agreement. Okay.
And this is that urge to avoid conflict at all costs, to maintain harmony,
Right.
which on the surface sounds good, you want a positive work environment, but
Right.
constantly seeking agreement can prevent those necessary disagreements and lead to decisions that aren't the best.
I see.
It prioritizes comfort over progress.
So the fear of ruffling feathers in the end actually does more harm than good.
That's right.
Okay, so that's 4. What's the final mind trap?
Okay, the 5th one is the control mind trap.
Control.
And this is the belief that we can and should be able to predict and control outcomes. Everything should go according to plan.
Right.
Leaders in this trap, they often become micromanagers, they resist delegation, and they just really struggle with uncertainty. They mistake activity for impact, believing that their direct involvement is the only way to ensure success.
Right. If I don't do it, it won't get done right.
That's right.
Okay, now, you know what? I think we have a really good example of this. Don't we have that case study of the divisional CFO?
Oh, yeah, he was a classic example of someone caught in both the control and the rightness mind traps.
Oh, wow. He had both.
Yeah, he really felt he had to personally approve every single financial report.
Oh, my gosh.
Talk about a bottleneck.
Wow.
And implicitly, he was signaling a lack of trust in his team.
All right, if I have to check everything, you must be doing it wrong.
Exactly. And he was so convinced that his methods were the best, the most efficient, that he just dismissed any suggestions for streamlining processes or even, adopting new technologies.
Wow.
And what's really insightful here is how his need for control actually limited his team's growth and even his own ability to think strategically.
So his attempt to ensure quality actually became the biggest obstacle.
Exactly.
So how did he eventually, get past these limitations?
Well, through some targeted coaching, he started to become aware of the assumptions that were driving his behavior.
Okay.
He began to experiment with delegating tasks, and you know what? He found that his team was really capable and often had even better ways of doing things.
Oh, he was surprised.
He was.
That's awesome.
And this shift in perspective really freed him to focus on the bigger picture, the strategic initiatives.
Right.
And that ultimately had a much greater impact on the division's success.
Okay, so that's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
We need to constantly question our own assumptions, actively seek out different perspectives, challenge ourselves.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Hogan Development Survey,
Okay, the HDS.
those leadership derailers.
Mhm.
What does the HDS actually tell us about how these inner tendencies can play out, especially when things get tough?
The HDS is a really fascinating tool because it doesn't just look at your strengths.
Right.
It actually identifies those personality traits that, when you're under pressure or feeling insecure, can become exaggerated and actually work against you.
Wow.
So think of it as the dark side of your strengths, the potential pitfalls that emerge when you're not at your best.
Interesting.
And these are the tendencies that can damage relationships and erode trust.
Okay, and I know that these derailers are grouped into 3 main clusters.
That's right.
Let's start with moving away.
Okay, moving away.
These are the avoidant tendencies. What should we know about this group?
So, moving away derailers, these describe leaders who tend to withdraw or become overly cautious when they're facing pressure.
Okay, so they retreat.
Exactly. You might see someone who scores high on cautious, for example, becoming almost paralyzed by analysis, delaying decisions to avoid making mistakes.
Right, so analysis paralysis.
Exactly. Then you have the skeptical leader who might become super critical, distrustful of others' motives, and that creates a very defensive atmosphere.
Right, nobody can be trusted.
Exactly. And then a reserved leader might become emotionally distant, not connect with their team at all.
Right, very closed off.
While someone with leisurely tendencies, they might seem really cooperative on the surface, but they subtly resist expectations and authority.
Oh, that passive aggressiveness.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these behaviors often come from a fear of failure or a fear of vulnerability.
That makes sense. I think we have an example here, don't we?
We do.
Of that regional tech CEO.
Oh, yeah.
He had those strong, cautious tendencies, right?
Yeah, and his risk aversion really slowed down product launches. He wanted everything to be perfect, every detail, every potential problem anticipated, and that meant they missed some really crucial market windows.
Oh, so he missed opportunities.
He did. And their competitors who were willing to take more risks, calculated risks, and iterate faster, they gained a real advantage. His caution in that fast-paced industry became a real liability.
So in that environment, his strength, being thorough, when it got amplified by pressure, it actually held him back.
It did.
So how did he try to overcome this?
He consciously started practicing making decisions with less than perfect information.
Okay.
He set deadlines for himself and his team to prevent that endless analysis, and he started actively seeking feedback on how quickly he was making decisions. It was all about building that muscle for quicker action.
Right, becoming more comfortable with, not having all the answers. Okay, so let's move on to the second cluster, which is moving against those more aggressive tendencies. These sound like leaders who might overassert themselves.
Exactly. These are leaders who tend to be overly assertive, really competitive, or even manipulative when they're under pressure. Someone high and bold, for example, might become really arrogant and dismissive of other people's ideas. They might take excessive risks without thinking about the consequences.
Right, because they know best.
Exactly. Then mischievous leaders, they might bend or break rules for their own personal gain or even just for excitement.
Oh, wow.
Then you have the colorful individuals who just crave attention and might dominate conversations. They overshadow their team member.
Right, it's all about them.
Exactly. And then imaginative leaders, they might jump from one idea to the next without a clear plan, and that creates confusion and instability. And what's really fascinating here is how these behaviors often mask underlying insecurities or a need for validation.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's like a cover-up.
That's right.
Okay, I think we have an example here.
We do.
That bold GM in pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges that he faced?
Well, he had a pattern of making big decisions, like strategic decisions, completely on his own without consulting his team.
Right.
And this not only alienated his colleagues,
Right.
but it also led to decisions that were just poorly informed that disrupted operations.
Right, because he didn't have all the information.
He didn't. And he created a lot of unnecessary chaos. His confidence really bordered on arrogance, and he just didn't value those dissenting opinions.
So his decisiveness, which can be a strength, taken too far, became dictatorial.
Exactly.
How did he learn to change his approach?
Well, they introduced him to these structured decision-making frameworks that required him to actively seek input from his team before making any big changes.
Okay.
And this forced him to slow down, listen to other perspectives, and actually build consensus.
Oh, so instead of just saying, this is how it's going to be.
Exactly, even when his instinct was to just act immediately.
Okay, good for him.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the third cluster, which is moving toward.
Okay.
Those are the approval-seeking tendencies.
Right.
So what are we looking at here?
So these are leaders who are really motivated by that desire to be liked, to be accepted.
Okay.
And a dutiful leader, they might be overly compliant and struggle to assert their own opinion, even when they have really valuable insights.
Oh, right. They don't want to rock the boat.
Exactly. And someone with dependent tendencies might avoid conflict at all costs and really struggle to make decisions on their own. And what's really insightful here is how that need for external validation can actually prevent these leaders from taking risks, from having those tough conversations that are necessary.
Right, because they might upset somebody.
Exactly.
Okay, so that desire to be agreeable, to be liked, can actually prevent them from really stepping up as a leader.
That's right.
Okay, so with these HDS derailers, the big takeaway for our listeners is to really think about which of these might sound familiar.
That's right.
Have you ever received feedback that you're too hesitant or too dominant? Or maybe too eager to please?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because understanding these potential derailers is a crucial step in developing that self-awareness and mitigating their impact, right?
It is. It is.
Okay, so now let's move on to that CCRT approach.
Okay, the CCRT.
I know this is a mouthful, but how does this framework help us understand those recurring patterns in our relationships?
Well, the Core Conflictual Relationship Theme, or CCRT, it provides this really powerful lens for understanding those underlying emotional dynamics that play out in our relationships,
Okay.
especially during conflict.
Right.
And it helps us identify those recurring patterns of, like, our wishes, how we perceive other people's responses, and then our own responses. And all of that can keep us stuck in these unproductive interactions.
Right, that same loop over and over again.
Exactly. And it really gets to the heart of why certain dynamics feel so familiar and yet so frustrating.
Oh, yeah, like here we go again.
That's right.
Okay, break this down for us. We've got these three elements: wishes, responses from others, and responses of self.
Okay.
What do those actually mean?
So wishes refer to our kind of implicit needs or desires in our relationships.
Okay.
And these aren't always conscious. We don't always say them out loud, but they're really driving a lot of our behavior.
Yeah.
For a leader, a wish might be to feel respected and valued by their team.
Okay, makes sense.
And then responses from others are our perceptions of how others are reacting to us in those interactions.
Okay, so it's how we're interpreting it.
Exactly. So the leader might perceive that their team members are, dismissing their ideas, for example.
Okay.
And then responses of self are our own reactions, our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on those perceptions.
Okay.
So in our example, if the leader feels dismissed, they might become defensive or aggressive, really pushing their point. And what's really interesting is how our perceptions can sometimes be skewed by our own past experiences and even our anxieties.
Right, so we're bringing baggage to this situation.
Exactly. We create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, because if we're already expecting that reaction, we're going to act in a way that gets that reaction.
That's right.
Okay, so it's this cycle: what we want, how we see other people, and then how we behave. And that just reinforces those initial perceptions.
It does.
Okay, so how do we actually map this out?
Right.
How do we map out someone's CCRT so we can actually see these patterns?
Well, the process involves looking really closely at specific instances of conflict.
Okay.
And you typically analyze a few recent episodes. And you're identifying the core wishes of the person in those situations, how they perceive the other person's response, and then their own reaction. And by looking across these different episodes, you start to see themes, those recurring patterns, the core conflictual relationship theme. And then once you have those themes, the goal is to understand what are the assumptions that are driving those patterns and how can we come up with more adaptive ways of responding. It's about breaking free from those automatic reactions that often don't help us.
Right, they're not serving us.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of examples, we have that case study of the COO whose CCRT was analyzed, right?
My dear, yeah.
What did that reveal about his interpersonal patterns?
Well, his CCRT revealed this deep-seated wish to feel valued and respected by his colleagues.
Okay.
But he often perceived their questions or challenges as a sign that they didn't trust his judgment.
Okay.
And his typical response to this perceived lack of trust was to become really defensive, overly assertive, almost as if he had to prove his worth by being dominant.
Okay.
And what's insightful is how his behavior, which was driven by insecurity, likely contributed to the very lack of trust that he feared.
Oh, wow. So he was creating the problem that he was afraid of.
Exactly.
So he wanted to be respected and valued, but his reaction was actually pushing people away.
That's right.
What was his turning point? How did he actually start to change this?
Well, by understanding his CCRT, he started to realize that not every question was a challenge,
Okay.
and that his defensiveness was often a totally disproportionate reaction.
Right. Too much.
Yeah. And he consciously started practicing active listening and asking clarifying questions instead of assuming those negative intentions.
Okay.
And this small shift in his response created a much more open and collaborative dynamic.
That's great.
And ironically, that led to him feeling more valued by his team.
Wow. So it worked.
It did. And so the practical takeaway here is that by understanding your CCRT, you can start to reframe those ingrained interpersonal patterns and prevent those knee-jerk reactions that just escalate conflict.
Right. And nobody wants that.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's bring this all together with the story of James.
Okay, James.
He was the divisional GM.
Yeah.
He's a really good example of how these three frameworks can actually intersect and lead to that derailment that we've been talking about.
Yes.
What made his case so, illustrative?
Well, James was this high-performing leader. He had a great track record of success.
Okay.
But his inability to manage those reactive tendencies, those internal dynamics, and his interactions with others, it created a perfect storm, And it really highlights how even exceptional talent can be undermined by these hidden barriers.
So on the surface, he had everything going for him. Where did things start to unravel?
Well, his strengths, like his focus on results, his drive,
Okay.
they were all underpinned by this really strong need for control.
Okay.
And that was a classic mind trap for him. He was convinced that his direct involvement was absolutely essential for success, and that led to micromanaging and reluctance to delegate.
Right. I have to do everything.
If I don't do it, it won't get done right.
Okay, and what about his Hogan derailers?
Right.
How did those contribute?
Well, he had several key derailers. His score on bold was really high.
Okay.
which made him overconfident. He often dismissed others' input and took big risks without really consulting anybody.
Okay.
He also showed tendencies of being excitable,
Excitable.
meaning his passion could quickly turn into frustration or even outbursts when things didn't go his way.
Okay.
And then he had skeptical tendencies, which made him distrust other people's motives.
Yeah.
And that made collaboration really difficult. So it's this powerful combination. His need for control fueled his overconfidence, and his quick temper that eroded trust.
Right, so it's all connected.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like those mind traps and his derailers, they were causing friction in his relationships.
They were.
What about his CCRT? How did that fit into all of this?
Well, his core wish was to be seen as the successful driving force behind his division. But when other people, whether it was his team questioning his methods or senior leadership scrutinizing his forecasts, responded in ways that he saw as challenging his competence, he became defensive, aggressive, and authoritarian.
Okay.
And that reinforced this pattern where his insecurity about being seen as successful led him to push people away.
Wow.
So his fear of not being seen as the best actually led to behaviors that undermined his success.
It's tragic, really. So what was the breaking point?
Yeah.
When did this all come crashing down?
Well, it was during a strategy review with the regional CEO and the board,
Okay.
and they raised some legitimate concerns about his revenue projections.
Right.
He was being very ambitious,
Okay.
but instead of, having a constructive dialogue, he became very defensive.
Okay.
Publicly dismissed their concerns and basically said that they just didn't understand the market as well as he did.
Oh, no.
And that was a huge breach of trust. It really damaged his credibility with senior leadership.
Yeah, that sounds like a career-limiting move.
It was.
So what were the consequences of all of this?
Well, the fallout was significant.
Okay.
He lost the support of key stakeholders. People started to bypass him. His peers didn't want to work with him.
Right.
And ultimately, he was passed over for that regional CEO role that he really wanted.
Oh.
Things became so bad that he was asked to resign.
Wow.
And tragically, even in his exit interviews, he couldn't see his own role in his downfall.
Oh, wow.
He blamed external factors, office politics,
It's a really powerful reminder that these unchecked reactive tendencies can have serious consequences. So what are some of the big lessons that we can learn from James's experience? What can our listeners do to avoid a similar fate?
Well, the first step is self-awareness. James never really understood his mind traps or his potential derailers or his recurring interpersonal patterns. Seeking 360-degree feedback, engaging in some honest self-reflection, those are really important steps in identifying those blind spots.
Right, you have to know yourself.
You do.
And then secondly, it's really understanding your CCRT. If James had recognized his need to be seen as the expert, how that defensiveness was pushing people away, he might have been able to see those criticisms, that feedback, as an opportunity to grow rather than a personal attack.
Exactly.
And third, developing those emotional regulation skills.
Right.
James's reactions really alienated people. But practicing those techniques, like pausing before you respond, reframing that negative feedback in a more positive light, being curious about other people's perspectives, these can really help you navigate those difficult interactions.
That's right.
And finally, strengthening your executive presence through self-awareness.
Right.
James's lack of control, especially under pressure, really undermined his credibility as a leader.
It did.
Structured reflection, mindfulness, even executive coaching can help you develop that self-mastery and lead more effectively, especially in those really high-pressure situations.
Absolutely. And James's story really shows us something fundamental. Managing these reactive tendencies isn't about changing who you are at your core.
Right.
It's about gaining that self-awareness and the flexibility to lead more effectively. It's recognizing when your natural inclinations might be working against you and learning to choose a more constructive response.
So, to sum it all up for our listeners,
Yeah.
take some time to think about your potential mind traps.
Right.
Are you holding on too tightly to your identity?
Yeah.
Are you oversimplifying complex situations?
Right.
Do you always have to be right?
Those are important questions.
Think about your Hogan derailers. Under pressure, do you tend to withdraw?
Right?
Do you dominate?
Yeah.
Or are you maybe too eager to please?
It's good to reflect on that.
And then really reflect on your CCRT. What are those recurring patterns in your relationships, especially those conflict situations?
That's right.
And most importantly, start practicing those emotional regulation techniques.
That's where the real change happens.
Exactly. And with that in mind, here's a final question for you to ponder. Considering all these frameworks, can you think of a past leadership situation in your own experience that might have been influenced by those unseen mind traps or derailers, or those recurring interpersonal patterns? And what's one small shift in your response that you could try in a similar situation in the future that might lead to a better outcome? That's where real growth begins.
That's where it starts.
That's it for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.